great presentation. A lot of times, films and TV shows will use storyboards to get their point across. So they're drawings of what they actually want to see in the film or show. So while I'm explaining what happened as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, I want you to draw some pictures instead of writing notes. Okay? So, and there is space for you to write a caption if that's needed. And it might be, just so you have an idea of what we're talking about. Okay? So I have a front and back if you need it. It's just a little bit different way to take notes.
Excuse me. Can I see?
So you definitely need something to write or draw.
No, no.
Okay. All right. So last week we talked about a lot of different things, actually. We talked about the Compromise of 1820, which dealt with slave states and free states. We talked about the Compromise of 1850, which also dealt with slavery and slave states and free states, which introduced the idea of popular sovereignty. And then lastly, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, like Caitlin said, is all about letting the people decide whether or not to be free or slave. Now, and I can't remember if we had this discussion. What are some of the good things about letting the people decide for themselves? Ruth? So what?
Basically, half the people actually are happy.
Okay, so there's the majority is going to be happy with the decision, right? What else?
It kind of wants the government off the hook for choosing.
Oh, interesting. I like that. So it gets the government off the hook, and it puts the pressure, the problem on the people, if it becomes a problem, right? Okay, I like that. What are some disadvantages to letting the people decide for themselves?
Not everybody's gonna agree.
Yeah, not everybody's going to agree. What else?
They'll probably make like 5% of bad decisions.
Okay, so we might make some bad decisions.
Some people can come in and like mess with the votes.
Yeah, and I think I alluded to that in the video that we watched. Definitely talked about that, Emma. Yeah. So, yeah, major conflict. What else?
It ignores the law of the 36-31 because they can go into the
Exactly. So it totally takes out the Missouri Compromise. It's like no longer valid anymore. Okay. So if we see this, what do you think the result of popular sovereignty was?
It was probably
Well, maybe.
there was a
But-
war.
Yeah. So there's definitely a negative outcome to popular sovereignty.
It was good intentions.
Good intentions. Maybe. Maybe. Remember, Stephen Douglas introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act so he could get a railroad going through his state. Yeah. All right. So here we go. We just talked about that. Boom. All right. So here is effectively what the Kansas-Nebraska Act did. It took away this line. We still have Indian Territory in Oklahoma. So popular sovereignty. These have not been organized yet. Utah, New Mexico, Territory have not been organized into states yet, but it's about to go down for Kansas. Okay. All right. So moving and contingent. And by the way, this is so interesting. My intern from 5 years ago made this PowerPoint. Okay, so he got this meme 5 years ago. All right, so for Kansas to become a state, it needs to be organized, and the president at the time was Mr. Pierce, and he appoints a pro-slavery government in Kansas, which is interesting because what does that tell you about the position of President Pierce? For or against slavery? He's for it. Okay. So, in response to that, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the New England Immigrant Aid Company wants to fill Kansas with anti-slavery settlers. So, New England refers to the states that are like Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Vermont, Connecticut, those areas. Okay? So, they actually promote and say, hey, we will help pay for your voyage over to Kansas if you vote against slavery. All right? However, Missourians want to make sure that Kansas becomes a slave state. Why?
Because they're a slave.
They're a slave state. They don't want to be, they would effectively be surrounded by free states on either side except for the South. Who's south of Missouri? Arkansas is. And it's what? It's a slave state. So it wants some backup, basically. All right. So again, territorial elections are going to determine whether the state legislature will be anti or pro-slavery. So how could you draw something like this? What would you draw to represent some of this information? Okay. What do you think, Caleb?
Maybe like 2 different voting booths with like a line of people in each one.
Love it. What would those voting booths have on it?
Maybe like pro and anti.
Sure. Could do that way. Or you could also draw a group of people moving to Kansas. They could either be Missourians or from the New England Immigrant Aid Company, waving flags of pro or anti, something like that. And again, those lines that are underneath there are there to give you a caption if you need for clarification. I can't remember if there's, no, okay, that was it. Give you a chance to draw something there. What does contention mean?
Is it like intentions?
Not intentions, no. Con is a more negative term, like pros and cons. Pros are positive, cons are negative. So moving to Kansas and possible conflict. Okay. Not possible conflict, there is conflict. Right. Okay. So keep drawing. So there are 1,500 registered voters in Kansas. So white men are registered to vote in Kansas. There's 1,500. When it's time to vote, 6,000 ballots are cast. What does that tell you?
They didn't count all
Whoa. They didn't count all of it?
Other people.
There's too many.
There's too many. There should only be 1,500 votes. Okay? Yet there are 4,500 extra ones. Okay? That's a problem. Okay? So the result of the election, or not election, but vote, is that a slave state. It becomes a slave state. But obviously, based on these numbers, it's fraudulent. It's a rigged vote. So a lot of people are like, "Woo! It became a slave state." But there are a lot of people like, "Yeah, that's not cool." So there's one group of people. They're called the Free Soilers. They want Kansas to be free. So they actually go to Topeka and create their own constitution to outlaw slavery, even though it goes against the outcome of that first vote. All right. So the Free Soilers like, yeah, we're not going to accept the outcome of this election. So we're going to create our own constitution that outlaws slavery. Okay. So would that continue to be part of the first thing, or could you create something that represents the Free Soilers? What could you draw here, if anything?
People counting the votes.
Ooh, I like that. Yeah, cool. So Lily said people counting the votes. So this primary source up here, just so for your information, is a handbill or flyer that called for a meeting of the Friends of Van Buren and Free Soil, Adams, and Liberty. Come one, come all. Talk about free soil. You can also maybe have a group of free soilers writing a constitution. Something like that.
You can make it to where it looks like the Free Soilers, like the leader of them was standing on a rock, like, we won't accept that.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think about it, there's actually two governments that are being created. One that's for slavery, one that is against. There you go. So Kansas has two governments, and here is a small map about where some of these cities are. Topeka is here, and Lecompton will be introduced in a minute. So Free State Legislature forms in Topeka, Kansas. But then a pro-slavery legislature forms in Lecompton. Look how far apart they are, which is not very far. And it's on the river for better transportation. Okay. So, yeah, I wouldn't have put them that close, just in case there is a war that breaks out. So, and again, this is just a definition. There's other nicknames for the Free Soilers: Free Staters or Jayhawks. So, do you know what the mascot for University of Kansas is? It's a Jayhawk. And that's found in Lawrence. And then border ruffians. Here's another nickname. Border ruffians are for slavery, and they're mostly from Missouri. So maybe introduce these two names here in a drawing of some sort. What's a ruffian? What does it sound like? What's the root word? Rough. Okay. So looking up the definition, it says a violent person, especially one involved in crime. So I wonder if they gave themselves that name. Or do you think someone else gave it to them?
Someone else.
Maybe so. I mean, I don't know where it came from, but that's what we've been calling them. So Kansas has two governments, and that's a problem, of course. And from the map, you can see some of the areas where there's some major violent outbreaks. Lawrence, Osawatomie, Potawatomi Creek, and something in French. Notre des Citizens, maybe? Okay. So more elections, more fraud. So they obviously understood that the election was fraudulent, so they're going to try it again. But this time, there are 2,843 votes that have been cast, as opposed to what it should have been, around 1,500. All right. So what does this say again has happened?
It's those in there. There's no there.
It's not the actual outcome. Okay. So what is this picture of? We've got a cemetery with "I voted" stickers on it. Huh? This is how you make a fraudulent election.
They're using like dead people's names.
To register to vote. Yeah, to vote. Yeah. So a lot of times, men would change clothes. Maybe they'd grow facial hair, shave off the beard, go in with the mustache, shave off the mustache, go in with clean cut face, and vote a couple times. Or pay people to go vote for the dead people. So, of course, 1,700 are fraudulent. But the outcome is still fraudulently the same, that pro-slavery state. So it's for slavery. So Congress is like, yeah, we can't have this. So they actually send a special committee to go investigate these elections. Okay? And they determined that if actual settlers of Kansas had voted and those votes had been counted, that the state would have been a free soil state. So how could you draw maybe Congress coming in and doing something? Investigation. Okay. So they came up with this, said the current state government that's pro-slavery is invalid, illegal, has no power to create or pass any laws. So Congress comes in and says, yep, this is fraudulent. It actually should be a free state. So draw some kind of maybe investigation. How could you symbolize an investigation? We watched Magnum PI last night. Magnum PI, private investigator. Think of a magnifying glass or something to use to investigate. All right, so there's conflict at the government level within Kansas. Then it becomes violent. In a minute. So Kansas becomes divided. Congress says, no, it should be a free state. President Pierce says, you know what? I don't agree with Congress. Because remember, he originally set the government to be for slavery. So Congress says one thing, the president says another. So now not only Kansas is divided, well, Washington, D.C. had already been divided, as we already know. So, and he calls the Free Soiler government insurrectionist. It's like with terroristic tendencies. The Free Soilers reject President Pierce's rejection. He's like, I don't accept what you say, so yikes.
So basically everyone is mixed up.
Mm-hmm. I reject your rejection. So we should not be surprised by this, since we've had already two other compromises at the government level. So here's when the bleeding begins. Beginning in May of 1856, violence starts to break out between pro-slavery and anti-slavery towns. Free Soilers versus the Border Ruffians. So in May of 1856, Border Ruffians attack, or actually it's called the Sack of Lawrence, destroying most of the town. And so we have a drawing of Lawrence, Kansas, which is just south of Lecompton, on fire. So Border Ruffians attack the city of Lawrence and basically burn it to the ground. This is known as the Sack of Lawrence. If you've ever studied ancient history, you've heard of maybe the Sack of Rome, which is generally the same idea. You destroy everything. So what could you draw? I mean, there's a drawing up here as well.
A house on fire.
Mm-hmm. Or whole buildings on fire.
You have buildings with people running around like, I know.
Yeah. Little stick figures with their hands in the air. Maybe label this the Sack of Lawrence. So a lot of times when a group of people attack another group of people, that other group of people want what? Revenge, yes. So, in our heads, a lot of us are going to side with the Free Soilers because they want a free state, because they don't want to have slavery. But that doesn't mean necessarily that they're the good guys, okay? This is where humanity gets really complicated. Sometimes we do the wrong things for the right reasons. Right? So the Free Soilers do decide to fight back and get revenge. Here comes John Brown, y'all. Okay? So John Brown has a really interesting backstory. He's from Connecticut and New England. He lived in New York. He had all sorts of jobs that didn't pan out. No, but he was extremely motivated to fight against slavery. He's what they call a militant abolitionist. Okay? So he and his sons, he had like 18 children, by the way. A lot of them did not survive to adulthood, but a lot of his sons had already moved to Kansas to become free soilers, and they asked their dad to come with and to help the cause. So we know what an abolitionist is, but what is a militant abolitionist? What do you think that means? What does militants sound like? Military. All right. So how does he want to get rid of slavery? War. And at this point in his life, he's willing to do almost anything for it. So he had believed it had been the time had come to fight fire with fire. So y'all are going to attack us, then the only thing we have left to do is attack you. So he's definitely going to talk about John Brown. So after the sack of Lawrence, in retaliation, there's something known as the Potawatomi Massacre. Okay? So this is most infamous action in Kansas. Infamous is usually not a good thing. If you're infamous, you've done something bad to gain that recognition. So what he did with some of his sons was kidnap 5 pro-slavery men from their homes and executed them with broadswords. So a broadsword is a very tall, probably as tall or if not taller than I am, sword. Okay? So why swords? I don't know. To make a statement? Probably. You could have just shot them if that was the route you're taking. So because of this particular incident or event, this set off a cycle of retaliation. So you're going to do that to me, then we're going to do that to you, and then it continued over and over and over again. So how could you draw the Potawatomi Massacre?
You draw boxes and draw in those boxes different ways of how people got revenge and killed people.
Well, specifically, the Potawatomi Massacre is John Brown with swords. That might make a statement. So some of these names, if you are paying attention, like Potawatomi, which is different, and there's another town called Osawatomie. What do you think that reflects? What do they sound like? Maybe. What kinds of names are they?
Indian.
Yeah, Native American names, for sure. So there definitely is not a military presence in Kansas at this point. And who knows what side the military would have been on at that point. I mean, you're supposed to take orders and carry out the orders regardless of how you feel. It would have been, it would have been interesting there. You know who these guys are? You should. There's a movie that came out at the minute. It's Tom and Jerry. You know who what the dog's name is?
I watched this video.
Spike. Spike is his name. So how do you stop the bleeding here? So it's like they ripped off the Band-Aid. Remember we talked about it was just being a Band-Aid, these compromises? This is, wasn't a good fix. So the violent responses lead to more violent responses, and John Brown eventually leaves Kansas because he's got another plan in mind, which we'll talk about later. But a new governor takes over, and how he keeps things relatively peaceful, I don't know. Okay. But there's still small groups of anti and pro-slavery forces that they continue to fight each other all the way up to the Civil War. So we're talking about 5 years before the Civil War, there are fights going on in Kansas continually. So according to some, 55 people died, and over 200, there are estimates that up to 200 people died because of the guerrilla warfare. What's guerrilla warfare? How do you fight using guerrilla techniques? Caleb, what do you think?
Isn't it like you're light and mobile, so you like strike them really fast?
And usually like an ambush type kind of thing, using the environment to camouflage you. And, yeah. So stopping the bleeding actually didn't occur. So if you remember the video that we watched, Kansas didn't become a state until after the Civil War started. But in the meantime, there were over 4 different constitutions that are drafted during Bleeding Kansas. One is pro-slavery. The others are free state constitutions, since that would have been the legitimate legal one to have. So finally, in October of 1859, the Wyandotte Constitution passes. So that's just the name they gave the one that they accepted. And they did vote on it. The citizens did. So there were more for it than against it. January 29th, Kansas was admitted to the Union as a free state. So what could you draw in one of your last squares there? What's the outcome of Bleeding Kansas? Mm-hmm. I remember. Yeah. Kansas is a free state. How could you draw that one without any words? How do you show someone is free? Or could you? How could you do that? I think of chains. Slaves sometimes were bound in chains. But if you're free, you break those chains. Well, I wonder what other people were thinking about when they were watching this unfold.
They're probably scared.
Yeah, I think so. So this type of violence, I don't know if they were used to violence or not. We tend to be desensitized to it today, I feel like. But yeah, I think maybe a lot of them were scared, especially maybe some of the states that were surrounding Kansas, maybe.
A lot of the explanation.
I think so. How do you think they felt about the government?
The government never want anything to do.
Yeah, so today, if you talk to people about how they feel about government today, they're like, they're divided. They can't get anything done. 200 years ago, it seems like the same thing, almost. So consequences. So the consequences of this revealed that popular sovereignty in this case did not work. So while it may have, again, like someone said, good intentions, the results of those good intentions did not pan out. So, as Wesley from Princess Bride would say, we are at an impasse. What is an impasse?
A problem.
A problem that we can't get past, right? So it's become such a problem that something must be done. I think that's it. We're just getting more violent over the issue of slavery. And that is Bleeding Kansas. So tomorrow at the beginning of class, I'm going to give you a letter from a free soiler. And I want you to figure out what this letter is, what the purpose of the letter is. And you have a couple questions. You have 3 questions to answer. Okay? But you can't get to the letter until you've done the quiz. You remember the quiz that you're supposed to do? Okay. So we will hear from a free soiler and her perspective and see what she needs or wants. Okay?